What's up, Mud fam? Welcome to another edition of Macrodose here on Trends with Benefits. My name is Kyle Thiermann. I work as the head of editorial at Mudwater, and these are long-form conversations. And this one is with none other than the VP of Brand at Mudwater, Dersu Rhodes. Dersu worked as the creative director at Vice for about 9 years, and he is all in the title. He's a creative motherfucker, and I get to work with him often here at Mudwater. In this conversation, we talked about the art of making documentary. We talked about his years at Vice and blending storytelling with the constraints of advertising. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I think you will too. If you are a mud drinker, we would love to hear from you. So if you take your morning mud, I want to know what you put in it, how you make it. Do you froth it up with foam, or do you drink it straight up like a cowboy or cowgirl? I want to know. So just bust out your phone, record about a minute of audio, and let me know your recipe. That simple. Don't overthink it. Just pretend like you're leaving me a little voice memo. And then you can upload that audio to podcast@mudwtr.com. Just send that email over, and if we play it, we will ship you a free Mudwater mug. We've got all kinds. We've got a Fuck Your Coffee mug, we've got a Chai Believe mug, and we have a Shroom Head mug. So if any of those accoutrements interest you, just bust out your phone and send us a little voice memo. And if you're new to Mudwater and you want to try this product out, we have a very special discount for you listeners. You can just head over to mudwtr.com, type in the code name TWB20 at checkout, and get 20% off your first order. That's TWB20 at checkout. All right, that's it for now. Hope that you enjoy this conversation with the VP of Brand at Mudwater, Dersu Rhodes. I was kind of hoping that intro would have more of like a fucking, you know, like it built, but then I didn't do it, but I'm not going to re-record it. So that's what you get, everyone. Please welcome to the show, the VP of Brand at Mudwater, Dersu Rhodes. Okay, that was better. Well, you're an onion. I'm just keep peeling back the layers.
I mean, this isn't something that I should probably even proudly talk about, but the one story that comes to mind when my career crashed and burned was
your freestyle rap battle career, which I had no idea about.
I just started at Vice, and I had carried this skill throughout my life, and it was an evening where a bunch of people were out back, and we used to have these moments after work where the whole crew would be out there, and it would always be a scene. You would have not only the crew that worked there full time, but you would have, it was this little kind of area with these two picnic tables and this back alley area and the concrete, and we were back there and we were smoking this massive blunt, and everyone was hanging out, and I didn't, people would just run through there. So you would just have, like Hamilton from Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia would just be like hanging out, or you'd have, Jake Burghart or Trevor from Noisy. And this one evening we just got super blazed, and I was with a bunch of cats from the music channel, and
this is Vice music channel.
Yeah. The Vice's music channel. And these guys started talking about rapping, and I was like, oh shit, I can rap. And I just said it out loud, and then I was like, oh, did I just say that? And everyone's like, looks at me, and they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, I can flow. I didn't even know what to call it. And then next thing I know it, Justin Staple and I, Justin is one of the head producers for Noisy, one of the probably most legendary Noisy producers, who was such an integral part of bringing so many emerging artists into the scene. I mean, he helped break a lot of people that were SoundCloud rappers that had never been discovered. And so we square off, and somebody starts doing a beatbox, and I had smoked this weed, and I completely just panicked. I knew before I started that I was going to fail. I knew that I couldn't do it. I was so paranoid, and I just mumbled some line that I'd already written like 5 years ago, and then made up a fake word that didn't exist. And the head of Noisy, Trevor, was so embarrassed that he just left. He just went inside. And it turns out that the guys that were out there with us, one of them was Stunna Man, who's a legit rapper who was there recording an album. And then another 2 rappers from his crew, and they were dying. Like, everyone was so mystified by this whole experience, and these guys were so, I mean, just their faces, and they were like, bruh. And so next time I remember they came through Vice, and they were like, what up? And like yelled across the office at me, and I was like, oh man. But anyways, that was it. After that, I never freestyle rapped again. That was it.
Really? You ended on that note?
Yeah, it was
traumatic.
I don't know. I think I just realized that it was just a phase, and I grew out of it, and I just didn't have it anymore. I think it was probably because I stopped slamming beers so often. Yeah,
well, sometimes you need, well, I mean, it's interesting that weed made you more paranoid, whereas having a couple drinks would just give you that little looseness to be able to flow. Like, I speak Spanish way better after a few drinks.
For sure.
But I don't think the same is true with weed. Like, I'll start talking, and then there will be the voice outside of my head that's judging me. Like, that was such a stupid thing to say, Kyle. Like, as I'm saying it, while still all the attention is on me, because I was just like, here ye, I have a story.
Yeah. It can be amazing. I think you can have these amazing moments where you're just on fire and everyone's laughing, but it can quickly just turn into an ego show, and you realize that you are a fuck up even before you even finish what you're saying.
Yeah. I totally feel that way. It can, like, weed can very much go either way for me. That happened to me a couple nights ago at our friend Chris Keener's birthday party. I decided to smoke a joint before going there, and I had no idea that I should have known, but like, all of his friends are really smart. So like, every conversation I went into like turned into this like high frequency mode where I was just like, oh God, I can't keep up right now.
And they're all looking you right in the eyes super intensely. They can see into your soul.
They've done like all the work to make good eye contact, and are like asking really thoughtful questions too.
The hug is really long, and it feels extra long because you're super blazed.
Yeah, I literally, and I had like my cowboy hat, so like some girl came up to me and she's like, "Are you from the Oregon Trail?" And there was a moment where there was this little fire, and like I like walked up to the fire, and they were like, "So awesome! Like, where'd you get the cowboy hat?" I'm like, "Oh, well, Chris and me the cowboy hat, and it makes me feel like a cowboy, and I was on the Oregon Trail, and this, and I literally said that, like literally mumbled, and they all just started laughing at me.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I'm Chris's friend. Bye.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, I'm glad that we can actually notice that that's happening, and that this is where we are in our lives, where we have to be careful with it,
spiritual growth. Yeah, you can. Self-awareness is a two-sided coin.
Totally.
So you said you told me that the fastest way that reporters would build rapport at Vice was
by doing drugs as soon as possible with the person that you were reporting on.
So this was like known around Vice.
I mean, I think it was one time we went before we started I started to get into helping produce, because really a lot of times you're wearing so many hats. Even if you were, doing design or creative directing, you were coming up with stories, and you were like, if there was a story that you were interested in and you wanted to pitch it, or some sort of branded content campaign concept, a lot of the time you had to see if there was even interest within the subject or what was going on within that world. And so you would send emails or just call people, hey, I work at Vice, you know, what's the deal? And yeah, so I think what I realized is I when I first started, I just had this dream of making a doc, you know. I think getting something greenlit was there at the beginning of when I was there. I still there was a lot of legends that were there that helped, you know, found kind of the gonzo journalistic style of Vice, where you had Thomas Morton and so many legends at that point. And I remember sitting down with Jed, who's one of the producers who helped produce a ton of content for them in the early years for HBO. They won an Emmy with him as one of the producers. And he said to me, you know, if you can get the subject to a point where you can do drugs with them, if you show up in one carload, because when you show up with 2 cars or a train of cars, it starts to get pretty intimidating for a subject. And really minimize, I mean, even down to the way that you would shoot camera angles, not having a camera up in someone's face early on in the shoot, having it lower so that you weren't intimidating them, the size of the camera gear, you know. I think there was so many different really subtle things that you wouldn't think about that really allowed Vice to have this super authentic connection to the talent and let the talent really, I guess, in a way, be themselves in their purest form, in the sense of they weren't being impacted by the camera. And I think, you know, you feel it even the start of us in this conversation. If we were just meeting each other, it would be hard to jump in like that. But if we, you know, had done drugs before together or had an experience where we get to laugh a lot and you unpack that. And I think there's also this part of it that's like, if you know, for example, smoke a blunt with someone right when you first meet them, there's this part of you that they realize you're cool and that you're not a narc, that you're not trying to make a joke of them. You're on their level. It's really pretty impactful of how quickly it shifts the dynamic.
Yeah, it makes your job so much easier.
Yeah.
I realized when I started this podcast many moons ago that the thing that felt special about it was that I was getting interviews with surfers that were different than other interviews that they were doing, because they were talking to me as a peer. And some of those stories then, like, they were just better. Like they would, because they're like, oh, you kind of get it, right? So we, you know, when you're out there and like a big set's coming and blah, blah, blah. And like, that was one of the main early pieces of feedback that I got with this podcast, was people were like, you're actually getting these conversations that are not really out there in other surf media. And I didn't even feel like I was doing that much work, right? But it was just that we had the experience before the interview that built some kind of rapport. And I mean, even before this interview, we went on a run, swim, run. So it's almost like it doesn't matter what the thing is before the interview, but if you can get them to shift into a different mindset that is less self-conscious, you're going to get a better interview.
Yeah, I love that. It's such a cool concept. And there's a part of it too, where even with us this morning, just swimming out around Santa Monica Pier, and I'm still at the point where I'm getting a bit spooked being in open ocean swimming. And so I got a crazy adrenaline rush, one from the water temperature, you know, and swimming without a wetsuit, and then having the goggles where I could see into the ocean and see what was coming at me. And this is one of the first time I swam in open ocean with goggles. I got really pretty scared, probably 2 or 3 times throughout that swim. And I know the stats don't support me being scared, but still you feel it when you're in the ocean. And I was nervous a little bit about even sitting on this podcast with you. But compared to swimming in open ocean, right, I feel very mellow right now. Right, I'm in a very good place.
Yeah.
You know, I got spooked and now I'm like, okay.
Yeah, you do the scariest thing first and then everything else is like in comparison to that.
I love that idea of starting also your day with the most difficult thing.
Right.
I love that concept so much. I think we're talking about that, and maybe it was even Atomic Habits or something of that nature, where the most daunting task, you just nail it first, right when you wake up, or, you know, after your little ritual.
Right.
I think that's so cool.
So I mean, I want to get back to Vice, but before we do, you've gotten really into cold plunges.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Based off of it was through the pandemic, and I struggled in a lot of ways. I don't know why. I felt I got a little agoraphobic in the sense that I just started. That's when you're afraid of public.
Yeah, kind of fear of the outdoors is agoraphobic.
Totally. I didn't really realize how much the news was impacting me. And while I was at Vice, we were so close to so many stories about what was happening. And I couldn't not look at what was going on, because I'm looking at the homepage every morning and hearing from reporters that are working on stuff. And so I was really spooked at that point, and I got to the point where I was at home so much, just me and my cat. I mean, almost a year and a half. I did a couple small trips, but really was at home a lot. And it got so fucking weird for me. And yeah, I got kind of depressed. I mean, not even kind of, I got very depressed. And then got invited to do a swim with the Great White Swim team, who are a bunch of crazy Aussies who do a little run and a cold water swim in the ocean. And then got that feeling that when I came out was so good. And then ended up by being up in Montana for the holidays, where I'm from. And me and my brother chopped a hole in the ice and got in. And that was such a game changer for us, night and day, of how our energy was at that point. I remember the snow wasn't very good on the mountain, so it was just incredible, the shift that happened. And I posted a couple of videos, and just of me talking very candidly about the fact that I'd been struggling a lot that year, and a lot of people connected with that. And I got some really beautiful comments about how they were feeling similar, and then realizing, you know, the power of the cold, and started to research it. And it was a game changer for me. I mean, honestly, some of the most probably shifting moments of my last year were based on this idea of getting in cold water, driving through Yellowstone, looking for places in the river where I could jump in. I mean, it's kind of changed the whole game about, you know, traveling in the winter, because all of a sudden you start to look for water. I mean, it's amazing, streams that you can access, and because you know that rush is so intense, and yeah, it's really amazing.
So when you talk about this shift, how would you describe what shifts? Is it a conversation in your head about yourself? Is it how would you actually articulate that shift?
Yeah, I think I used to think it was the preparation, because you do the deep breathing, but I recently haven't really done that much of a prep. A lot of times we'll just get in pretty quickly, and it's an insanely deep breath that happens on the first moments of entering cold water, right? And you got to control it. And I think what I realize, it's really the shift that's happening for me is the fact that I'm aware that my brain is telling me to get out, and I'm overcoming that. And I'm getting to a point where I'm able to really divide the part of me that wants to evacuate, and the part that is calm. And I'm able to get to a point in my practice where I'm completely relaxed in a crazy cold temperature, and it's done through your mind. That's it. It's the act of literally calming yourself and knowing that you're going to be okay, even though your body's telling you to get out and your brain's telling you to get out. You know, it's really interesting. And I think the shift for me is really, there's two parts. One is that deep breath, the realization that I'm in control of how I feel, which is insane, and watching it take place in real time. And then also, you know, there's so many scientific things that are happening where, you know, it's your adipose tissue, and there's so many things with your blood circulation stuff that I should probably know more about.
Neuroepinephrine.
Yeah.
Right. You get a big release of neuroepinephrine that sustains after. That's that part of the science that I know about with cold plunging is there is this kind of lasting effect, whereas a lot of drug highs, right, it'll just spike and then it kind of goes straight down. But in my experience, it does last throughout a good portion of the day and can kind of kick you into a gear that can sustain for the rest of the day.
Yeah, it's amazing the way your body feels too. And I know, yeah, it's been really such a blessing. And I have a freezer that I've rigged thanks to a YouTube video it's on a timer and it stays right at around 40 degrees and it's pretty janky. And I have to prop the lid with a 2x4, but it's amazing. Yeah.
So when you were working at Vice, and people would ask what you did, how would you answer that?
Yeah, it was such a journey. I mean, it started with me getting the role as the design director for the West Coast. So they opened the first West Coast office in Venice, and I had been working in design for a long time at that point. And it was mostly around interactive design stuff within website and, dealing with some 360 YouTube stuff and all kinds of things in that realm. And then I joined and really was such a journey through so many different stages, starting primarily with a focus on design, moving into art direction within photography and video, into finally creative direction. And that whole journey was over the span of almost 8 years, 7.5 years. And so I got to see really also insanely differentiated chapters of Vice throughout this period. I was there kind of through the end of, I would say, the wilder days where, it felt a little bit more rock and roll in a sense. I remember there was like a Slayer, there was a sticker on the dispenser for the towels in the bathroom that said, please carve Slayer into arm before returning to work. I was like, those kind of things. And it was it was awesome at that stage. And then I guess to answer your question, sorry for the rambling side there, but I would say my role, was a creative director and at the end was overseeing a team on the branded content side of Vice, which was essentially trying to bridge the world of documentary, gonzo journalism, all of the things that Vice was known for, with getting brands to pay you for that. And we'd found that if we could get a brand to pay for a piece of content that we wanted to make and that our audience loved, then that was a home run. And it happened, but not a ton. It's pretty tough to do.
Yeah. Well, it's you're now trying to satisfy two audiences.
Totally.
That have very different objectives.
Yeah. One of them just wants to see their logo super big and the car as much as possible.
Right.
I can't even tell you how many projects I worked on where these conversations were super wild. One of the probably most interesting points of that, just to talk about that for a second, was I worked on a massive project, and it was a story that we were doing. This is probably one of the peaks of my career, was working with my team on a massive account for Levi's. And Levi's was amazing in the fact that they put so much money into this campaign that we had pitched to them called the 2020 Project, which is essentially focused on highlighting 10 to 12 young people who were positively impacting the world in different ways, whether it was environment or through socially. And what we did was we pitched these different individuals who were making incredible strides in their areas. And one of them was Rosalie Fish, who's a young Native American woman who was a athlete who's running to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women. She actually ran her races with a red handprint on her face to symbolize the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we presented her as one of the ideas for a concept for a film, and Levi's said okay, and we ended up by going on this shoot to go find her, and she was in Iowa where she was running track and field, and I had put these mood boards together that were these really dramatic, beautiful mood boards of this grand finale moment of this doc piece where Rosalie we would be in her room in her dorm while she's over her shoulder while she's painting this handprint on her hand and then putting it on her face. And we had kind of pictured this really incredible moment, and we pitched this to Levi's, and they were like, hell yes, this is amazing. Wow, we have chills, all these comments. We'd flown up to San Francisco to pitch this thing. And when we got to Iowa and we were with the client and we were talking to Rosalie about the treatment and what we sort of saw these storyboards happening, and she said that she didn't feel comfortable doing that on camera and painting her face. And then when we went back to Levi's, they weren't stoked on that at first, you know, and this is kind of what the story we were really excited about this idea. But then we like quickly realized as a group, it was really amazing, you know, to have a very real conversation about what we were doing, and really realizing in that moment that the most important thing in the world is that we tell this story the way that it's actually happening. And if Rosalie wouldn't have normally worn a handprint during that race, and instead she said that she would have worn a little piece of ribbon on her shoe to in memory of a young woman who was taken in Montana off the side of a highway. And that was her moment. And we got, you know, we filmed that, and it ended up by being so much more beautiful and so much more real. But that conversation was really intense, you know, and you're in these really intense moments where you're trying to capture something authentically with a lot of heart and make it feel as if you're a fly on the wall. But at the same time, you know, there's a Levi's logo at the end of the film, and they're wearing Levi's. We don't have any product moments, and there's no shout out to Levi's while it's really Rosalie's story, and she's so amazing. But at the same time, it's like this balance. And so what a lot of my job was being this in between of these two worlds, of trying to protect the subject and make them feel loved and appreciated and seen, but also to make the client feel that they understood that we had their best intentions in mind, and that we were really championing their brand throughout the whole thing. It was a really trippy job in so many ways.
What advice would you have given to yourself right when you were starting that position?
I love that question. I think there's always this moment where as creators that work with brands and with trying to raise money for financing and things, I think a lot of times you think you need to present something that they want to hear, and it needs to be really elegantly presented, and you have to say it perfectly. And I think a lot of times what I realize is that you're much better off just shooting it straight and just really being authentic with what this situation is. And in that moment, I remember standing in this room with, I think there was 15 of us in a circle with the client, and saying that, you know, this is what's going on. And I wanted to be perfect in the way that I presented this idea. I had this like script I'd written out, you know, these words that I needed to, I had all these talking points, and what it came down to is me almost in tears. Like, I think my eyes watered up because it was really meant a lot to me, this project. And I just said, you know, we're here. This is her story. You know, I think it was to the point of almost being like checking in with myself as to like, what was the real thing that I knew was right in that moment? Like, what was the thing that I felt the most in my heart, and just being transparent with it. And a lot of times that means saying, I have no idea what to do next. I want to work with you guys on this. I got to be honest, we came so prepared. We did so much work on the front end of this, and nothing that we've planned looks good. And our talent doesn't want to do this. So let's work together. We're here for you. We'll stay up all night if it takes. You know, that was really, I think, the goal at that stage, is like to make them understand that we feel really, we're here, but at the same time, I guess what I'm trying to say is, yeah, it feels sometimes like you just don't know what to say, and you just got to be real.
Right.
That's it.
Right.
Yeah.
What's interesting for me to think about is that often the client, the brand, is seen as like kind of the big bad overlord with all the money, and you know, they just want to make the story shitty, and you know, all these, it's like creatives doing this breakdance battle between them and the brand. But from another angle, the person who you are talking to from that brand has a boss, and they don't want to get fired, right? So they want to know that you have their back too, right? It's just like, it's ultimately, it's just all people who are trying to make something work with a lot of moving parts.
100%. It's totally, I mean, I have so many stories about this kind of thing, and I think it's just, what it comes down to is, we, like you said, we're all sort of in this game where we're trying to come up with solutions, and we don't want to look bad a lot of times. But man, I've quickly realized that if I stop worrying about looking bad first and just put myself at the center of it, whatever that is, whether it's taking ownership for what's going on fully, and sometimes I think in a sense it's just taking, this is on us, you know? And I think like that's a big part of the thing. Nobody wants to say that.
Right.
But I think it's important.
Yeah. So when you I want to talk a bit about process of filmmaking and actually getting things over the line, because as I mentioned before the interview, like, you know, I talk to a lot of people. I get a lot of emails from people who are like, hey, like, I'm thinking about doing this documentary, you know, or I'm thinking about shooting it, and gonna do this, or I just talk, you know, the amount of stories I've heard from people who went and shot something that they were excited about and then felt totally overwhelmed and were never able to finish the project is more often than not. And I want to run a scenario with you. So if some young filmmaker, let's say they haven't even really made a film yet, but they know how to edit, they know how to shoot something, and they're like, all right, I want to do this documentary about this polluting industry that's dumping a bunch of shit into my local Montana river. And I want to do this story, like, but I don't really know how to tackle it. What are the conversations that you think that person should have before they go out and try and pull it off, and or questions they might want to ask themselves so they don't end up 2 weeks later just wanting to pull their hair out and give up and never make another film again?
This is fun.
Yeah.
So at this stage, they've got a story that they have a hunch about something, and they've done a bunch of research on the front end, and they're getting ready to shoot this thing. Yeah.
So they've got the story, and they've got maybe a couple characters who they could tell the story about, but they don't really know how to move forward from there. Yeah.
A lot of times that first stage, from what I've started to learn, is that it's a lot about the conversations that you have with those characters on the front end. And really the make or break of most stories is the type of access that you can get and the way that someone will be on camera. They always, you know, you'll hear people talk about in the film process when they find a character who's incredible just in the phone conversation, they get really excited. It's gold, you know. Most documentaries are really built on the backs of the characters, right? And the way that they are. And I talked a little bit before about authenticity and the way that you come across on camera. If someone's sometimes super nervous and has a hard time opening up, it can be really challenging, obviously, to cut something with that. Sometimes it plays into the story if they're like very awkward. But I think in most cases, it's those first conversations that you have and really making them feel special and taking a lot of note of how does it feel? How does the person feel? And I would say a lot of times I've heard of producers that actually go to meet with these characters without a camera at first and just spend time with them, because rarely are you going to really benefit from, there's moments where in part of the story where you would want to show up to the door and capture that whole thing of first meeting the crew, because it's kind of plays into the story. But a lot of times you want to have, for example, like a master interview where you're sitting with someone. It's really night and day, spending time with somebody. Usually plan those towards the tail end of a shoot, because those like really intense one-on-ones, there's a lot of instances where you'll pull people out of the room. And I think this is me jumping around a bit, but I would say overall it's like planning out how you're going to connect with those characters, what kind of access you can get, and doing that research on the front end immensely. Just thinking about what kind of locations can we get this person in where they're going to feel the most natural, or we'll get to see them interact most naturally. And obviously within a documentary, you have so many different types of styles of setup. So you might have a setup where, they call it verite, where it's essentially this real life happening in front of the camera, and being able to capture that without any sort of input from the crew or anything. And so a lot of times that's shot, where they're at the kitchen cooking or whatever. And those pieces are usually used to intercut in between transitions or things like that. And I think thinking about it like that, it's like, okay, well, what kind of access can I get? And what are they willing to give me? So I would say, to summarize, those first conversations, really talking about, where do you hang out? Oh, do you think we could come with you to that monster truck rally? Cool. What about, like, do you have any friends you usually go with? It's a lot of those conversations. And if they're really starting to open up, oh yeah, I've got 3 friends. We usually meet before for beers. Amazing. Do you think we could come along? And really start to, you'll feel it build itself based on whatever that is. And I think a lot of the time that's the first steps that I would say going through is like a lot of those phone interviews. And
right. So you mentioned, like, do you have any friends that you go with? Right. So you are, like, from what I'm understanding here is like you are looking for them to be able to be their most natural.
Totally.
And bringing other people into that situation where something might happen, unexpected, can help move the story along.
Yeah. And just give you that access, because essentially what you're trying to do is get as wide of a picture as possible. And also, I mean, the issue is a lot of times you have one, afternoon with someone, and that can be really challenging. Most of these longer form docs that you see, that people will spend weeks with people, because a lot of the beauty and the magic of documentary comes from these moments in between. And a car ride where you just start to run the camera while they're talking about their father, you would never think, you can't plan for that. That's impossible. You're not gonna be like, oh, are you gonna talk about your dad on this? That's, I realize a lot of it is just like creating room for that. And I mean, there's instances where you have films where you don't have that ability. You have 3 days, you got to plan the whole thing out. We're going to shoot the gym now. We're going to shoot her running here. We're going to have an interview here. We're all sitting in the hallway with our, headphones on, listening to it. You're asking these questions. That's part of it too. But
would you ever help craft those questions?
Definitely. Yeah, always. I mean,
what did that look like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the first round of those questions is just, I always think if I was really sitting with them, like, what do I really care about and want to hear from them in a selfish way? A lot of times that's some of your best sort of foundational questions. And then I think from that point, a lot of times it's thinking about the story arc, right? And if you build out, for example, a traditional kind of hero's journey, or like some sort of arc that's got, you know, a tension point and then a resolve, and if you sort of map out that story of what you're trying to create, a lot of times you'll notice throughout it that you do need different moods and tones within the way that person is presenting information. And then also you need different talking points that are going to help you sort of paint a full picture of what's going on. I mean, if you were talking about an instance that happened, you would probably want to also set up as much of that as possible. And so that would look like any sort of conversations that would help you introduce the mood that person was in that week.
Right.
What was happening. Like,
so what's an example of that? Yeah.
Let me think here. So I think that there's moments where, just to go back to the Rosalie Dock that we did, a lot of the conversations that we had with her were based around running and what it was like to the main narrative, I think, was this idea of running with this in honor and to raise awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there was also a really beautiful story that was happening that was around the fact that she's from the Muckleshoot tribe in Washington and was running as the only Native American woman in her school in Iowa by herself in the winter with no family, no friends at that point that she'd come with. And she was staying in a dorm room in the middle of like a really intense winter. And I realized that a lot of times, like, the questions that I wanted to know about, well, what was it like being there by yourself? Like, what do you have to make you feel like home, you know, to remember home? And I remember that at one point we started to think and pose ourselves the question of, what does she have there to anchor her to her people and to her culture? And at that point, we have this beautiful moment where she unwraps some stuff, a bear tooth from her dad, like her grandfather. There's like different something that she has that is there as like she helps heal some of the women that she runs with. And so you realize, like, in that moment, there was a lot of, it's not even about the main story, but it's about painting a picture of, like, what is it like to be someone who's in this place, has a lot of people looking at them strangely. The faculty, a lot of people didn't agree that she should be running with those kind of things around her face, and felt, you know, she was definitely an outsider in that sense. So I guess, like, I don't want to get too much in a tangent here, but I think in order to capture that, the depth of something, there has to be a sense of finding a place to anchor yourself into that story. And so looking for things that humanize people is a really beautiful way to approach that too, of like, how do we make yourself feel as though you could be that person? I think that, to me, is a lot of times the fastest way into a story, right? Is to feel as though you could be there.
No, totally. And I think that was expertly delivered. I love talking about this stuff because we're both obsessed with story. And I often think through, like, what's the internal conflict? It doesn't necessarily need to be, like, the conflict doesn't need to be some war, right? It can just be the conflict inside someone's mind. And with Rosalie, the conflict is, okay, some of the faculty doesn't actually want her to be doing this. Mm-hmm. She's doing it anyway. There's some internal thing that's happening there that becomes very human. And I think that, like, one of my favorite questions to ask on the podcast is, like, what was the conversation inside your head that was happening? Because it sort of reveals that there's a conversation happening at all times. With the cold plunge, right? It's like, oh, fuck, I don't want to do this. Okay, I'm going to do it. This is kind of scary, but I'm going to do it. You know, and all of a sudden that tension, like, brings people in. Yeah. And that's why I think that if, like, the best stories are ones where, you know, it's like superhero movies. Like, if you can't empathize with the villain, it's not a great movie. If it's just an evil person, you're not going to be able to connect at all. 100%. But if you can, like, if the storyteller can show some kind of wound or some kind of paradox within that, then it reveals the humanity. And I'm beginning to think too that, like, just delivering facts is not really what the world needs at this point. Like, I think that we're so often obsessed with, like, information, like, how is it going to apply to your life right now? But you can have a fiction story apply to your life if you can bring people into that conflict and those little decisions that need to be made. Because if they're reading or they're watching or they're listening, they're thinking like, well, what would I do in that situation? Right. And that's why Rosalie's story is so powerful, is because you're thinking like, well, shit. All right. All my, my peers, the faculty, like, there's this pressure on me to do this thing, but she's doing this other thing. Would I do that?
Totally.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of you kind of sum up story that way in a sense.
And also think about the connection and the depth that you find through something like that, because it's one thing to look as an outsider at a story that you might not relate to. I don't maybe have any, I don't know potentially anyone who's been affected by this. I don't even, it's almost like more than an epidemic. I mean, it's insane in the sense. Is epidemic just related to sickness, or is it?
I think epidemic is, I'm not 100% on this. I think epidemic is related to a nation.
Okay.
And pandemic is the world.
So I guess it would be,
we're in a pandemic.
Yeah. I guess in talking about the missing and murdered Indigenous women,
that's an epidemic.
Yeah. Right. And I think you might not relate to that directly, but if you are able to see yourself in Rosalie's story and able to really understand what it's like to be in Iowa or to be someone who's lost someone who's gone missing, the power of that is transformative. It will completely change someone as an outsider to a story to someone who cares deeply about it. And my goal, my dream within my work, and I would say anything creative that I do, is I think to share like a little piece of what I feel somehow. To emotionally, I want to help someone maybe come there with me. And I thought about this recently, and I think this is such an interesting thing. Like, imagine what you were like when you were a kid, when you used to play. And if you can kind of imagine yourself, like you have a friends over to play and you're playing make-believe, and you imagine what role did you play in that make-believe. And for me, I was always the person who, when my friend would come over, we would build some crazy fort, maybe at the top of the stairs, and I would paint the picture of where we were, usually based off of some film I had seen or a book I'd read. Being in Montana, a lot of it was around Native Americans and around what was going on at that 100 years before then. And so I would paint that picture, and the joy that I would find from the moment when I would look over and I would see that that person was there with me in the story. Like, we were in there together fighting whatever it was, Custer. And, and we were in that fort, and it was, that to me, it was, the joy was beyond. It was like we were in this imaginary world together. And I feel like a lot of my life has been trying to recreate that in a way. It's trying to find, I've been moved by something. How can I bring you with me? Because it feels really, I almost get teary-eyed thinking about it. It's one of the most beautiful feelings if you can be with someone there, in that story. And I think about, I have other friends who were the planners, where they love to set up all of the toys, and then they would let their friends play, and they ended up by being event producers, or they love hosting, right? In that big question, are you the traveler, or are you the innkeeper?
Right.
And thinking about that.
So that was great. I want to talk about scaling this kind of feeling. So it's easy enough to write a story or do a podcast where you feel like you're on the level, you're communicating from the heart. It's, you know, it's just kind of you and your perspective and you getting it out. Things become a bit more complicated. It's almost like that's, you know, you're like we're on a dinghy right now. And there's just two of us, you know, rowing through the ocean.
Yeah.
And it's pretty nimble. It's pretty easy. We're jiving with the conversation and we're able to talk about, creativity in this way. Scale that up now to, Vice, right? Or like a shoot on Vice. And then it's not just that shoot, it's many shoots that are happening. And it's all of a sudden it's international. And like you're trying to keep this tone throughout a scaling organization. And most of the time it fails.
Totally.
So how do you think about scaling creativity? And are there any examples that you can see of organizations that have been able to do it? And can you think of any strategies that they've implemented so that it doesn't just turn into this kind of perfunctory nothingness that we see in 99% of the world?
Yeah, man, it was interesting because I've thought about this a little bit, and it's really hard for me to find an example of a brand that has gone to a massive scale while keeping this. And I think there's a couple that come to mind. One of them is random, but SoundCloud, for example, I think is really interesting because as a business model, I'm not sure how successful they've been. I think they've had to do some you talk about lifeboats. They've had to throw a couple out at the brand, I think, to keep themselves afloat. But there's something amazing. I think it's one of the most vibrant, optimistic, loving communities on any platform I've ever seen as far as support. You post a set or you post a track, it's usually nothing but love. And there's hundreds, you know, I've gotten sets that I've posted where you'll get 200 beautiful comments from around the world that are cheering you on. And I would say it was a huge motivator for me. And it's a huge scale now. I mean, this has continued. And I think really it comes down to the users. And I think having freedom to be able to have a dialogue in that way and do it based around creativity that's coming from a very, I mean, I don't know if there's necessarily a lot of these posts, if there's a monetary incentive from it, aside from, I mean, I don't think SoundCloud pays for plays from what I know. So it's all kind of in this pure form of creativity and expression. And you've got amazing, you know, incredible pieces sitting next to pieces that someone did in their garage in 10 minutes. And so, but it's free. And I think there's something interesting in the way that that's scaled because it continues to be like a positive, beautiful environment. And I don't actually know what the secret there is. I'd be interested to almost dive into what that is, you know? And I think just to think about, like, use Vice as one example that I can kind of see what happened maybe. And maybe we could talk about that as this is the opposite of maybe what, and it's really tough to control. And I thought about this. So when I left, I wrote a letter that was a love letter to the brand. And I'd been there for 7.5 years at that stage. And I said that, you know, I was so proud of the work we had done and the people that I'd met there. And I've believed in this mission so full-heartedly. And I think the challenge is that it had changed so much because when you are not profitable, the stakes get very high. And so Vice at that stage had not been profitable. And although there was incredible content and beautiful stuff being done, they started to realize that they needed to build structure and systems. And structure and systems don't always tend to be the things that harbor the most beautiful creativity and the freest expression, you know? And I think in the early days of Vice, you had, I think, this kind of insanity that was very fringe in so many ways, and so many things were being greenlit based on kind of the cloud of the producer or just the hunch that let's just go, let's try it. And with that comes amazing art. And it was crazy. You felt it, you know, you felt like, how the fuck did they get greenlit to go there? And, you know, I remember some of the early pieces really being confused how anybody had approved this project. And you know, and
I mean, as an example, I remember the first Vice doc I ever watched, my big brother sent it to me, and it was of Ryan Duffy,
oh my
who
God,
I've since had a chance to have on this podcast.
What a legend.
About going down to the Caribbean and digging into this rumor that men had sex with donkeys in Colombia.
It's crazy. I never saw this one, but I mean, there were so many. Ryan was...
I mean, I was like 15 years old. Like, what the fuck? This is news? I mean, and it was... And to have my big brother sending me that was like this, you know, and then the one below it is with Thomas Morton, who...
Totally.
You know, I think he was like episode 8 on this podcast or something. But it was about him going into the Great Pacific Gyre and discovering this garbage patch.
Yeah,
and that
Jake.
one is like a young... environmentally minded guy was such a mind blower for me that someone who was just a few years older than me could go in and say fuck on camera and make me feel what it was really like to see the horrors of environmental destruction, which I felt was such a more honest tone and resonated with my young rage so much more than any of these plastified documentaries on environmentalism, because in the environmental movement, it's very common to just be G-rated and so terrified of being offensive in any way. But the rape of Mother Earth is, in my mind, one of the most offensive things we have going on right now. Yeah. And to be able to tell the story with that tone was so powerful.
Yeah. That's such an amazing point. I think that what's cool here is we could almost answer your question strictly through finding the things that don't work. And we'll play that game for a second.
Let's do it.
And I think exactly. I remember just to tap on the crazy stories. I remember the one with Ryan Duffy where he goes to Japan, and in order they interview the Yakuza is the first interview that ever done with the Yakuza on camera. And in order for them to do the interview, he has to get a tattoo with them, and ends up by doing it. I mean, it's insane. And that at that point, I remember seeing that, and meeting Ryan was like meeting a celebrity in so many ways, and he's the coolest fucking guy ever. And just, yeah, I mean, that early stages, I think it was so just stripped down, and it brings up a really cool point. And Jake Burghart, who was on that shoot in the Gyre with Thomas, and his wife Meredith, who's another amazing filmmaker, but Jake told me once, I remember this very clearly in the early parts of Vice. I came from a little bit more traditional advertising. I was working on Adidas. We did a campaign for the World Cup where we did the first 360 YouTube video where you were like inside the ball, and worked on a bunch of Apple site designs. And I felt really pretty confident in what I was doing, and was excited about wanting to inject that and prove myself. You know, I know how to make things look beautiful. So I kept trying to bring in ideas around how we could make. I always thought Vice felt a little like the lighting wasn't very good, and the color grade of the film was weird. And I remember the design wasn't very, I was like, you know, why can't we do some crazy motion graphic moves? And I remember Jake very clearly saying, every time that you add an element of polish, you separate the audience further from the content. Every time you add a fancy light, or, as I said before, another carload of people, or another crazy color grade, you give another sort of layer in between you and the audience. And there's something really powerful about this idea of having something be very stripped down, and not trying to, in a way, dress it up. And I think that's probably another clue to this whole scaling thing with purity. I think when you get into these large corporations and companies, you have sort of a code of ethics of stylistic choice. This has got to be glossy. It's got to have a little shine to it. The content's got to be, we got to look like it. We spent a lot of money on this production, right. And you've got executives who are looking at the other brands that are playing the same game. And then you come in with this, DIY piece that feels very stripped down. People start to have, be concerned. Well, it looks like we're broke. You guys look like you shot this with your cameras or with your phones. So I think that's like another clue, which is weird though, because now all of a sudden everything has gone to this like weird UGC thing where I can't figure out what's happening. But I think people...
What's UGC?
User generated content. People I feel like have caught on that it's individuals... If it feels the real, let me rephrase this. The more realistic, the more that people assume that you can trust the brand. Right. I guess is that's what's caught on. And I think Vice was probably a pioneer in that.
They were a pioneer in that, but I think that what Vice had that the user generated content, like Instagram video thing doesn't is Vice. There were some motherfucking storytellers there.
Yeah, it was a story arc.
It was story arc, and and everything else seemed secondary to the story arc.
Editing is so key. I found out that in an incredible way watching these editors work, and shout out to all those editors that were there, and some of them we've even brought on at Mud, which is amazing to do some pieces. But that is the highest art. To be a story editor who can come out with these logs of content and be able to cut it into something that's a story. They create moments out of things that you would never imagine were a moment. A look that someone gives another person in a Jeep. All of a sudden you've got an entire story beat that's created off of that. And that's a lot of that stuff did not come. People just go and capture it, and they say, "Good luck, figure this out." This shit, we got so much content, So I think, shout out to those guys and girls for sure.
Have you heard of the concept of the hedonistic creep?
No.
It's super interesting. So there's it's kind of all part of this community called FIRE, which is financial independence, retire early. So it's like this idea that you can save a lot, be a minimalist, and start to save huge amounts of your income by kind of living very frugally. Wow. And one of the main things that keeps people from retiring early is this hedonistic creep, where you start to make more money and you're then around other people who are making more money, who start getting more expensive things. And then you think, wow, that's a really nice couch. I'm going to get that couch. And then you get the couch. And then you think, well, my chair and my bed don't really match the couch now. So now I need to get a new chair and a new bed. And, this whole house is actually pretty small and janky. And it just becomes this new normal, right? It's like the analogy could be like cold plunging even, right? Like what is your normal that you start your day with, and everything is anchored to what that normal is. And there's a lot of studies in human psychology that your normal really hits a baseline very quickly, regardless of if you have millions and millions of dollars or are in prison. Like humans are so good at normalizing our situation, whatever that might be, that the hedonistic creep is one of these things where you get more money and then you kind of feel like you should be spending that money. And LA is an ultimate example of this, right? Where you have people who are earning $800,000 a year, but they're just working like mad because they feel like they have all of these expenses now that they need to pay. And I think that you could apply that same concept of the hedonistic creep to brands and content companies that start to become more successful, ironically, because of their authenticity that connects them with an audience. And then every time they add a camera or a car or a light to that process, they're just distancing themselves from that core audience that made them successful in the first place.
That's amazing. I love that connection. I think that's so right on. Yeah, that's a beautiful comparison to make, and I think it's something to be aware of, even as we, work on projects that we're working on now. Just being very conscious of that. What's our intention with why we're doing this? I think I love the saying about everything you wear, do, and say says something about who you are, everything. And so every decision you make as a brand, for example, or a storyteller, whether it's the title card or the lower thirds or the way that you transition between shots or how you conduct interviews says something and gives a message. I think people are so smart and we don't give them enough credit. I think a lot of times we just think, oh, this is just how you do it, and there isn't really a lot of thought that goes behind it.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's another trap that people fall into where they start making their stories for the lowest common denominator. So they're not treating people like they're smart. They're like, well, we are really going to dumb this down to the stupidest person in the room. And then everyone who wants something a little bit more sophisticated feels like they have no one and nothing that is speaking to them anymore.
100%.
Whereas I've always felt like people will rise to the occasion. Like if you can treat them like they're intelligent, they'll actually, like, you don't need to use crazy words and make people, like try and dunk on people. But I do think that, like, even if someone isn't necessarily like college educated or, has a super high income, like they understand deep concepts of life that often at often a more sophisticated level than people who have, just been in the ivory towers their whole lives.
I mean, that's why I think our country is so divided right now, is that you've got people that are talking down to half of the country and vice versa. There's like a lot of that. And that's problematic on so many ways. And I think one of my favorite quotes, and I should probably memorize this thing by now, but it's one by Stanley Kubrick. And he talks about the fact that the way to cut through someone, like to hit somebody all the way to their heart, is by allowing them to discover that thing on their own without spoon feeding it to them, because that thrill of discovery, I think he says, cuts right to the heart. And this idea that, if you can sort of convey something very straightforwardly, it's like you said, it's fact. You're just delivering fact. But if you kind of allude to something in an idea and let someone make their own connection to it, that stuff is so powerful.
Yeah. So I kind of cut you off around your love letter to Vice.
Oh,
so so you said like it was love letter.
Yeah, it was interesting because I actually I think I like even had part of it that I was the way that I started it off. I even sketched down something that I was thinking about before we had this conversation that I actually was interested in talking about, because I think it was like this idea that I first of all, I wrote it from a I wrote it from a 2-star hotel in Fargo, and I was talking about the future of leadership. I believe is weighted in yin leadership, and to me, it's the yang leadership that's destroying us and our planet. And I think that's like such a thing that feels to me still really relevant, and why I actually think that Vice eventually struggled so much and had a bit of a reckoning was based around this idea of this very kind of aggressive leadership that was not necessarily very thoughtful in a sense of how people were feeling. I don't think feelings were necessarily at the top of people's minds, and I think there was a lot of issues that came with that. And it was a lot of ways it was protecting the art was the first principle. And that really took priority in so many ways. And the people that were actually creating the art were traumatized because of that. And there was a lot of things that happened. I mean, we had a reckoning through Me Too. We had a large percentage of our leadership was let go. I mean, it was a very, very intense, super traumatizing period of time. And I had a very intense experience myself within it, where we had a mural painted in our department, and it was by an artist that we were really excited about, who's very edgy, who his content wasn't necessarily politically correct in a lot of ways. And I think just we never gave him a brief. He just painted, and he painted this incredible mural. And it was in one of the scenes, I didn't really see it at first. I had come in first in the morning and saw this mural, and it was really cool, and I was really excited about it, and it felt we were really supporting him. And then I noticed that one of the scenes was this man, it looked like a man with like a devil head or something, was peeing, and there was a girl that was down below that was semi-topless, and he was like peeing on the girl. And at that point, I didn't even think about it. It didn't even register. It was a huge mural. There was so many scenes, and one of the women that worked on my team was really offended. She came in and immediately came to me and said, "This makes me really uncomfortable. You know, what is this all about?" And I completely dismissed her. I remember being very defensive, getting super angry with her. I remember saying, you know, you're not respecting the art. Like, this is an artist. This is Vice. You know, this is what we do. Look at the magazine. And she was super hurt. She went to HR, and I ended up by getting called in later that day. And when they presented the argument, I still felt like I was fighting for the art. I was almost this weird sense of needing to make sure that it didn't get jeopardized because of someone's feelings. And it wasn't until, honestly, maybe 2 weeks after that I somehow had this strange realization of what had happened. It might have even been sooner. It felt like a long time. And I remember just realizing that this wasn't right. And I don't remember how it came on, but I ended up by going and painting over it one weekend on a Sunday. I just went in with a white paint and painted over that mural. And it was intense. It was a very strange moment. And at the same time, I felt so ashamed that I hadn't had the sensitivity. And I realized in that moment that the separation between art and your culture of your company, safety has to be the first thing on that. And part of me was in this battle between understanding, well, when are you too safe, and what's the line? You know, where do you draw the line? And, you know, this woman who I really respected and I felt really sad about, you know, making feel this way, she came to me in solace, and then I completely disregarded her. And it was like, yeah, it was a very strange thing, and I'm still processing. I actually, you know, but I think there's an interesting thing here, though, this conversation around art and the system of running a company. And I think that Vice, in a way, was so heavily weighted on the side of being a supporter of the art that the well-being of the people that worked there was disregarded. And a lot of times the side effect of that was that you had people that were really unhappy, and it was traumatizing in some ways.
So here's I didn't work at Vice, so I don't know, but I want to push back on this a little bit because I think that we're in a space right now where safetyism and kind of nerfing reality from anything offensive is resulting in the modern equivalent of mass book burnings, where anything that could potentially trigger anyone gets thrown out or gets you thrown off Instagram. And as a result, it paralyzes society and makes people terrified to do anything that could create truly great art. And any truly great art was offensive to people at a certain time. So there's that. I think there's also this conversation of employee well-being that might be different than safety, which is you know, as you said, I've heard you talk about how there was just this churning through employees at Vice, and a real fear of job insecurity, and and people just getting, feeling like they weren't being respected, and felt like they were just going to get replaced the second that they weren't working insane hours. So do you feel like there's any part of, and again, I didn't work there, so I'm asking, do you feel like there was any part of Vice taking a downturn that had to do with the retention rates being so low? And do you think that's maybe part of,
definitely.
Like, because I feel like that's a second thing that we haven't really talked about.
Yeah, definitely. And I think just to end that last kind of thought, I don't know the answer between, you know, I agree with you. I think in this case, employee safety and sort of the energy that you cultivate within a space is so important to hear everyone and to be conscious of that. And I think regardless of, I don't think it's up to us to decide whether, you know, I think in that instance, I feel really positive about the choice I made, you know, and I have a lot of respect and love for the artist and the person that was impacted. And I think, yeah, it was a huge learning. And I guess the reason I brought that story up was more just because I think in a way it was the question that was constantly being had at the company of like, right now it's art before taking care of the people. The systems that were implemented I remember it was, they weren't there. You know, you never really knew what was going on at the top, and you didn't really know what was going to happen next or why a decision was made. It was never really translated. The people at my level, you know, at that stage, which were, I mean, relatively high up in some ways of the creative department, a lot of times we didn't know why decisions were made. So we were found kind of traumatized by trying to protect the people that were really working in the trenches to make sure that they felt appreciated. But, you know, when they would ask a question, why was that decision made? We had nothing to say. I couldn't even tell them why. No idea. So I think that was one of the biggest reasons that we did have turnover as well, because you had someone who doesn't necessarily see where they're going. You might not feel like you're part of something if you don't feel heard and seen and appreciated at all times. And I think that is really the end point that I made in that letter, was that this is one of the greatest media companies that has ever existed. And all that would need to happen would be there to be a shift of focus and attention and appreciation for those people in the pay, in the way that they're compensated, and also just the way that they see their clear path forward of not just being a cog. And when you have a company that's that big, it's really tough to do. But I think, I mean, I would say like right now, and this is not a plug, but it's a really like a gratitude for where I'm at now at Mudwater, is this idea that having leaders like Shane and Paul who truly see us and are transparent fully with what we are doing and where we're going and how well we're doing, down to how much everyone's making, being public to the company to see, down to what is being spent on, down to clear direction. And it can be done usually with smaller companies, but how do you continue to scale that? Because right now it's such a beautiful environment to be in, and you feel very, very seen and very appreciated. And to me, the big question is, how do you do that with a large organization? Like, what are the systems that you implement when revenue is the main driver? And I love, there's Derek Sivers from Anything You Want in the book. He says, you know, if you start to make decisions based on revenue over your employees or your customers, it's a moment to stop and look around for a second and try to understand, like, is this really the best foot forward? Because if you think about that, and you start making revenue decisions over your customers or the people who work for you, you're in a tough place, I think.
There's a line that is, people don't quit companies, they quit managers. So I want to go back to your yin and yang moment. And as a manager, as my manager, actually, and someone who has managed teams for a good little while now, what are best practices that you have come upon in your time managing teams of people?
Get back to work.
Get back to work. Yeah.
Just kidding.
You are replaceable.
I mean, two things. One, actually, I'm not going to go on that story, but I had a quick moment where it was just, I remember I was frustrated because I didn't feel appreciated. I didn't feel loved, and I didn't know where I was going. And I went to a friend, a colleague at a party.
At Vice.
Yeah. I went to and I said, dude, I'm going to quit. And he said, quit. They'll replace you in 2 weeks with someone cheaper. And that was it. And in the moment I was like, you motherfucker. And I was pissed.
Yeah.
And then I realized he freed me, because if you think that you're at doing anything that because they owe you something, you're tripping. Because I think to be in a relationship because you think that that person owes you something is crazy. To be in a work environment like that is crazy. And so the minute he said that, I was very angry. And then secondarily, I realized that he was right. And I stopped at that moment being there for them. And I realized if I'm going to be here and play this game, it's got to be for me. And I've got to take control of that. And I think it's a good segue into my best manager probably experience that I've ever had, was when I started working finally with the creative department. And Straith, shout out to Straith, someone who I watched manage from such a incredibly humble and beautiful way. The way that she really, it was no ego. It was like, we were in this together. She would stay with us late. She was such a workhorse, would take on anything, didn't matter. And it was the first time I'd ever had a manager who just, was just very kind. And there was no flex about, my experience or this or that. And I mean, there were so many levels to it that I felt were so inspiring. And I think to this day, I realized that was the shift for me, because I used to really drive from a standpoint of being, if I can give the impression that I know what I'm talking about all the time, and that in any situation I know the answer, and I've been here before and you don't understand because you haven't spent as much time as I have, then that was really a place I came from a long time. And I found myself even now recently doing this work where I realize that just because you've suffered, it doesn't mean that someone else has to suffer in order to be where you are or to learn what you've learned. You can give them a much cleaner, clearer path with a lot less trauma. And so I think to me, it was realizing that coming from a leadership standpoint of yin, of being very open and saying you don't know something, and being kind and expressing your appreciation for someone and helping them line a clear path of where they want to go, really understanding where is it that they want to find themselves. And I'm doing a really interesting exercise with our business coach right now, Lee, where working with my team to really develop a clear path of, okay, if you want to go here, great. Imagine your dream scenario. What are you doing in this position? And then what is it that this position entails? What are you doing on a daily basis? What are the skill sets you need to have? Then looking at, well, what do you have already? Where do you excel? What are you missing? And how are we going to get you there? How are we going to help you get to that point and supplement those things you're missing? And if that's something I can do, boom, amazing. If it's something that someone else from the team can help with, if it's classes you need to take, we'll support that. I think there's so many ways that we can just kind of step back and realize, as a manager, you don't need to carry the weight of needing to know everything. Or I'm enjoying a lot of times saying I don't know in meetings lately, and just shutting up and listening to people talk, because a lot of times that's where you learn the most. You know, I heard an amazing thing too about in a meeting at all times, making sure that if someone hasn't spoken at the end of the meeting, hold space for them. Even on video chat, it's super awkward sometimes, but just be quiet and say, hey, there's some people that haven't spoken yet. If you want to talk, I want to open up the floor to them, and just hold space. You can literally do it for 30 seconds and it's the most awkward 30 seconds ever. But it takes some of these people that have the most brilliant things to say, who are more introverted, to be able to find the courage to be able to speak up. And usually those people have been listening the whole time, and they say the most intelligent shit, and they have the most to offer. And so that's the gems. And as a manager at this state of my life, like, that's my dream, is to be able to help sort of empower people that maybe don't see themselves as much as leaders to feel that way, and to feel empowered to be able to step up in that way.
Yeah, you did a good job coming into Mudwater asking a lot of questions, because you came in as the VP of Brand at a very high level. And from my perspective, for the first month straight, all you were doing was interviewing each of us, asking where are the holes in this boat from your perspective. Yeah. Rather than coming in from a limited perspective and saying, all right, I know where we need to go. We're going to do this, you know, aye, Captain, let's go. Rather you really took stock. And, you know, at this stage in the company, right, there's an infinite number of places that we could place our chips. And we only gain visibility on where to place those chips after everyone has communicated where they think we should be dedicating more resources. And it was really cool to see, man, because I had never witnessed someone come in at a high level at a company and see how to navigate that. But it did two things. I think that it allowed us to go in the right direction, right? So it was like, well, actually just the journey from when the customer clicks on the ad to when they buy the Mudwater and when they get the Mudwater is not nearly as smooth as it should be. So we got that intel. And the second thing it did was make everyone respect you, because they felt like they were being heard. And it was cool to see. And I think that it's really remarkable, just as a theme through this conversation, how much can get done by asking better questions, whether you're formulating a documentary or coming into a new company.
Thank you. That's so nice to hear. It was intimidating coming in, because there's a lot of brilliant people on these teams, you know, and I think, I don't know if you've figured this out, but no one knows really what is the answer.
Shane knows. Shane knows.
Yeah.
He has to know. Shane, you know, right?
Shane.
Where are we going? Paul, send me a wisdom. Send me a Twitter thread that tells us where we're
going. Yeah, exactly. I feel like the cool part about coming in like that too is that somebody said this analogy where we've been using the boat hole analogy a lot with the boat. I love visualizing this. It's because maybe you've got a captain who's up on the top deck. The captain has no idea what's happening in the bottom. And you've got someone who specializes in the specific craft, who's, for example, I don't know if boats have this, but I can imagine maybe there's someone who's good with putty, and they're in the bottom of the boat, just like puttying in between the boards, maybe. But I'm imagining the captain has no clue what's going on, but they know the boards so well that they can see where some of them are starting to give and there's water coming in. And so that person needs to be able to be respected in the same way. They're as much a critical part of this game. And so I think part of my, I guess, inspiration coming in was to come and speak to everyone and make sure that we could see the whole spectrum of what was happening. And I think it's interesting too, is like, this is a bit of a weird aside, but this idea that a lot of times people are just really incredibly good at one thing. And what I really am excited about is the idea of how do you because not everybody wants to, you know, sit on the top deck. Like some people just love a craft and they're really good at it and they don't want to move into a management position. And our system and our structure of business is set up right now where in order to be promoted, a lot of times you have to move up into more responsibilities and take on other things. And I imagine a model where the person who's amazingly good at a craft, who just wants to continue doing that, is rewarded in the same way and can grow in the same way and get better, but doesn't need to necessarily move into like a high ranking thing where they're on the boat. So I think that's just like a cool way of sort of an example of disrupting a system that is very archaic and honestly built on a very strange kind of like bureaucratic system.
Model.
So,
I think that's a really good point and something for us to contemplate, because using myself as an example, I'm a good copywriter, and that's some putty in the boat, right? That is going out to a lot of people, but it's not necessarily a respected position within most companies. I think Mudwater respects it. And like Shane had me coming in being like, this is actually a huge part of the voice and how we're communicating to people in a very direct way. And I really love doing that. I love writing so much. And I also recognize that system that we're in, where the more you move up, often the less time you get to do the craft that got you in the first place.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's cool to see in your context too. Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm excited about. We have such an opportunity as business people, as creators of systems, as people that start their own companies, to really rethink like what's the way that we want to move forward. And I think that it's exciting to be in this point where we're realizing a lot of those are broken, you know, and it's a cliche, but at the same time, I think it's really worth noting that this whole thing that's happened right now with people moving away from offices and realizing that, I can get a lot done and in a shorter period of time, and also to not be sitting at a desk. That's one break up of the system. And then what are other ways that we can really rethink the way that we are productive, or that we create and that we move forward?
Yeah. Keeping creativity at the center of it.
Yeah. That's a big part.
Will you tell your story of working on the dock as a boatman and having the girls rent a jet ski?
Yeah. Gladly. This is the punctuation point.
This is the exclamation point.
All
yeah.
right. Exclamation point. That's what it is. Good thing you're the writer.
Got you, bro.
Good thing you're the terms, the writing terms. Man.
You with your big terms. An exclamation point. Don't talk down to me, Kyle.
I grew up in Montana, and I think this maybe was the best job I had ever had at that point. I think I'd washed dishes. There was a few of those. This one was working as a dockhand at the marina in Whitefish, Montana. And our job was essentially to open up the shop on the dock and fill up the boats that were rental boats, kind of do inventory, drink 7 beers, and then gas up boats as they came in. And it was an absolute shit show. One time we built a jump on the end of the dock, and I had to go to the ER because I split my foot open while on the job, and riding a bike off the end of the dock, off the jump. And the same summer, we had a lot of tourists coming from out of town. And I remember this one morning, the gentleman who ran the wakeboard instructions, he had a joint. A lot of these are weed stories. I don't smoke much weed anymore. I sound like I'm such a stoner, but at the time I smoked a lot of weed, man. All right, just ease up. We smoked a blunt in the morning, and I remember just kind of zombieing around the shack.
I'm picturing like Caddyshack vibes.
Yeah,
like a lot of like short shorts and like
I think these are actually
aviator shades.
These were the times
some Huey Lewis in the background.
I wish we were that cool. These were like the Abercrombie and Fitch cargo short days that were like below the knee, camo, polo shirts.
Breathing deep.
Oh man! And so at this point, super blazed, and earlier that morning, I had sprayed an entire boatload of tourists with gasoline. I was filling up their boat, and I was flirting with the mom, and the boat was moving down the dock, and the gas line got tight and then sprung out of the nozzle and sprayed the whole entire boat. I had paper towels, and I was patting down the tourists, and their skin was burning, and my buddies were, bro, you got to pay for that gas tank. And so it was a weird day already. Towards the end of the afternoon, these 2 smoke shows from the UK showed up at the dock. And me and my buddy, thinking we're super suave, we say, okay, you take the older sister, I'll take the other one. And so we check them in. They say they want to rent some jet skis. And so I'm briefing the older sister on the dock, and I'm just sitting there with my polo shirt. It was probably a pop collar at this point. Probably had puka shells, Abercrombie and Fitch, long shorts. And I think I might have had gelled like blonde tips, bleach tips as well. I was a hot mess at this point. And I'm briefing her with my clipboard, and I'm telling her about the Wave Runner, and she's sitting on the Wave Runner, and I've got my foot on the Wave Runner, and she's sitting there, and I'm going through the checklist, and we reach the bottom of the checklist. I'm like, I think that's it. I think you're good to go. And she's like, really? And I'm like, yeah, hit it. And she guns the Wave Runner and goes about 3 feet and wham! And she smokes herself on the front of the Wave Runner, like plants in her stomach. She wrecks her chest right off the top of the Wave Runner where the handlebars are and comes back up like in shock. And I realized I had not untied the Wave Runner from the dock. It was such a mess. It was literally like, I mean, they were not interested in us after that. It was game over.
If the puka shells didn't stop them.
Yeah.
That certainly did.
I'm glad that we end on that story, because that brings me back. And also, it's also one of those things where you realize life used to just be so simple.
That's the point of the story.
No, I don't know.
So what I'm really trying to say here, Kyle,
don't smoke weed at work.
Life used to be so much more simple.
Don't smoke weed at work. Eat mushrooms instead.
Dersu, this is so much fun. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to reach out?
Yes, you can hit me up. Should I get my email or whatever?
Probably Instagram.
Okay. Dersu Rhodes. Sorry. You can tell I'm an influencer. At Dersu Rhodes, DERSURHODES. And you can check me out on SoundCloud. I actually have a lot of music up there. SoundCloud.com/Dersu Rhodes.
Thank you so much. This was a blast.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That's our show. If you enjoyed it, please give it a rating on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast. It takes about 60 seconds, and it really does help. So thank you to everyone who is giving this show a rating. You can go to trendswithbenefits.com to check out all of our written work. It's where Sara does a lot of her writing. It's where I do a lot of my writing. All over there at trendswithbenefits.com. It's also where you can sign up for our newsletter. Every week, we send out just one newsletter with our favorite story. And it's fun, it's funny, it's meant to just bring a little bit of delight into your Friday. Goes out to a few 100,000 people and has some of the highest open rates out there, we're happy to say. So you can do that at trendswithbenefits.com. If you have feedback on this podcast, you can reach out to us on Instagram at drinkmudwtr, or you can email us at podcast@mudwtr.com. That's also where you can send the voice memos. Just bust out your phone, don't overthink it, let us know who you are, how you like taking your mud water, and send that voice memo to podcast@mudwtr.com. And include your address, please. We need your address. And if we play the voice memo at the beginning of this podcast, we will send you a free Mudwater mug. So thanks to everyone who is sending those little voice memos in. We love getting them from you. All right, that's it. Get out in the world. Have a beautiful day. And thank you for your time and attention. I do not take it for granted.